Introduction: A whisper through the trees. The Wendigo. Just the name feels heavy, like the chill of an icy breeze brushing the back of your neck. Across the frozen rivers and dense forests of North America, the Wendigo has prowled the human imagination for centuries. Around crackling campfires, under starless skies, the Wendigo's legend is whispered in hushed tones. They say it's bad luck to speak its name too often, bad luck, or worse. For the Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, and others, it is not just a story but a presence, a force tied to the wilderness itself. The Wendigo stands as both hunter and reminder, a warning of what happens when desperation consumes us. But who or what is the Wendigo? A creature impossibly thin, its skin stretched taut like old leather over its skeletal frame. It moves with an eerie grace, silent, but for the cracking of branches underfoot or the faint rustle of leaves as it passes. Its hollow eyes burn with a pale, unnatural light, and its lips, if it has any, are torn and bloody, as if gnawed away by its own unending hunger. In some stories, antlers twist grotesquely from its head, like the dead branches of a winter tree. In others, it is shapeless, a ghostly presence that whispers your name in the voice of someone you love. This is the Wendigo, part beast, part spirit, and entirely hunger. It is said to haunt the frozen forests of the north, emerging when the nights grow long and food grows scarce. But the Wendigo is not born of the cold. It is born of desperation. When hunger gnaws too deeply, when isolation strips away our humanity, the Wendigo comes. It doesn't simply kill its victims. It consumes them, body and soul. Legends say that those who turn to cannibalism in moments of despair risk becoming Wendigos themselves. The transformation begins subtly, a gnawing hunger that no amount of food can satisfy. The victim grows colder, more detached, as though their soul is slipping away. And then, one day, they vanish into the wilderness, returning only as a monster. But is the Wendigo merely a metaphor for human frailty, a warning tale to keep communities strong in the face of starvation and isolation? Or is it something more tangible? Some believe the Wendigo is a spirit, slipping between worlds, seeking out the weak and the desperate. Others claim it's a physical creature, lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting for the careless and the lost. The stories vary, but certain details remain constant. The Wendigo is always hungry. Its appetite is insatiable, its very existence defined by its craving. Some say it grows taller with each victim it consumes, its body stretching grotesquely as it devours more and more. Others claim that it can never truly die, that even if destroyed, its spirit lingers, waiting to inhabit the next unfortunate soul. The fear of the Wendigo is as old as the land itself, yet it feels just as chilling today. Modern sightings and eerie encounters continue to surface. Accounts of glowing eyes in the woods, strange calls that mimic human voices, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Throughout this audiobook, we will delve deeper into the Wendigo legend. We'll uncover its origins and hear the haunting tales of those who claim to have encountered it, their stories threaded with fear and mystery. And we'll explore the chilling possibility that the Wendigo is more than myth, that it is a force, a presence, waiting in the dark. They say once you hear the Wendigo's tale, you cannot forget it. You might catch yourself listening more closely to the rustling leaves or feeling the weight of a gaze in an empty forest. The Wendigo, they say, has a way of staying with you, of planting itself in the corners of your mind, waiting for the perfect moment to remind you that it's there. So settle in, but don't get too comfortable. The Wendigo story is not for the faint of heart. And if you hear your name whispered from the shadows, don't answer. Not all voices are meant to be followed. Chapter 1: Born of Hunger. The origins of the Wendigo legend, is one of the oldest and most chilling in North America, deeply rooted in the lives of the Algonquian-speaking peoples, the Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, and Saulteaux. These were communities whose existence was intricately tied to the land, to the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The forest was their home, their provider, but also their predator, indifferent to the struggles of those who dared to survive within it. Out of this relationship with the wilderness, the Wendigo was born, a creature shaped by the cold, by hunger, and by desperation. Imagine the scene. A winter so brutal that the rivers freeze solid, the ground turns to impenetrable ice, and the trees stand like skeletal sentinels in a landscape of endless white. Food dwindles with each passing day, and the sun seems like a distant memory. Hunger gnaws not just at the body, but at the mind, a relentless force that strips away reason and humanity. It is in these moments, when survival feels impossible and the line between life and death blurs, that the Wendigo appears. According to the legend, the Wendigo is born when someone succumbs to the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. But it is not merely the act of consuming human flesh that creates a Wendigo. It is the desperation and greed that accompany it. The person who commits this act is said to be cursed, their humanity stripped away as they transform into something monstrous. They become the Wendigo, a creature driven by an insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied. No matter how much it eats, it remains forever starving, its emptiness growing with every soul it consumes. The transformation is as horrifying as the creature itself. At first, the victim begins to change subtly, their hunger deepening, their behavior becoming more erratic. Soon their body starts to shift, their skin pales, pulling tightly over their bones until they resemble a walking corpse. Their eyes sink into shadowy hollows, their teeth grow sharp, and their mouth widens unnaturally, as though to accommodate their monstrous appetite. By the time the transformation is complete, there is nothing human left, only the Wendigo remains. For the Algonquian peoples, the Wendigo was not just a creature of horror, but a moral lesson, a warning carried through the generations. It was a reminder of the dangers of greed and selfishness, especially in times of hardship. Survival in the northern forests was a communal effort, and to prioritize one's own needs over the well-being of the group was to invite disaster. The Wendigo served as a chilling example of what happens when that balance is broken, when desperation leads someone to forsake their humanity. Starvation, for these communities, was not merely a physical threat, but a spiritual one. To succumb to cannibalism was to invite the Wendigo into one's heart, to open the door to a curse that could never be undone. The Wendigo legend reinforced the importance of sacrifice and unity, teaching that even in the darkest moments, there are lines that must never be crossed. It was not just the act of eating human flesh that condemned a person. It was the willingness to abandon the bonds of kinship, to place one's survival above the sanctity of life itself. Basil Johnston, an Ojibwe scholar, described the Wendigo in haunting detail. Gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. Its complexion was the ash gray of death, and its eyes were pushed back deep into their sockets. What lips it had were tattered and bloody. It gave off an eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. This description captures the essence of the Wendigo as a creature that is both horrifyingly human and utterly alien. Its skeletal frame, a grotesque symbol of endless hunger, its very presence a violation of life itself. In some versions of the legend, the Wendigo is not a physical creature, but a spirit, a malevolent force that can possess the weak or the desperate. A person doesn't need to commit cannibalism to become a Wendigo. They simply need to let their fear and greed consume them. Once possessed, their transformation begins slowly, their humanity slipping away as they grow colder and more detached. By the time the hunger takes over, it is too late. The Wendigo has claimed them, body and soul. What makes the Wendigo truly terrifying is its permanence. Once the transformation begins, there is no going back. The person who becomes a Wendigo is lost forever, their soul corrupted and their body twisted into a monstrous form. They are doomed to wander the wilderness, consumed by their insatiable hunger, preying on the living to fill an emptiness that can never be satisfied. Chapter 2. The Wendigos many faces. The Wendigos image is as elusive as it is horrifying. Ask 10 people what it looks like, and you'll get 10 different answers, all of them guaranteed to chill your blood. And yet, certain details echo across the stories, like a shared nightmare passed through the generations. The Wendigo's form is not just frightening, it's unnatural, a physical manifestation of hunger and despair. In many tales, it stands impossibly tall, its skeletal frame looming above the treetops. Some claim its height grows with every soul it consumes, as though its insatiable hunger twists and stretches it further from human proportions. Its limbs are grotesquely elongated, ending in clawed fingers capable of slicing through flesh as easily as a cold blade. Its gait is said to be unsettling, as though it doesn't quite belong in this world, moving with jerky, disjointed steps or an eerie, silent fluidity. Its face, or what remains of it, is a patchwork of horrors. Some describe it as gaunt, with hollow eyes that glow faintly, like embers in a dying fire. Others say its eyes are empty sockets that see everything, a void that draws you in and strips away your will to resist. Its teeth are jagged, oversized, and blood-stained, each one a tool designed for tearing apart its prey. And then there's its mouth, a gaping maw that seems too large for its face, a black hole of hunger that can never be filled. One of the most debated details of the Wendigo's appearance is its antlers. In some stories, they twist grotesquely from its head, gnarled like the branches of a dead tree. These antlers are said to mark it as a creature of the wilderness, a being that is both part of nature and beyond it. In other accounts, it has no antlers at all, its head more closely resembling that of a decaying human or a malformed beast. The lack of consistency only adds to the terror. It's as if the Wendigo changes its form to suit the fears of those who glimpse it. But the Wendigo isn't just seen, it's felt. Its presence is often accompanied by a wave of dread that chills the air, an unnatural silence that falls over the forest. Birds stop singing, animals scatter, and even the wind seems to hold its breath. Those who have encountered it speak of an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though the trees themselves have grown eyes. And then there's the smell. The Wendigo carries with it the stench of decay, a foul, choking odor of rotting flesh and death that precedes its arrival. It's said that this smell alone is enough to paralyze its victims with fear, their instincts screaming to flee even as their legs refuse to move. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Wendigo is its voice. Legends say it can mimic human speech with unsettling precision, calling out to its prey in the voices of loved ones. Imagine hearing your name whispered in the forest, spoken in a voice you know, a voice that should not be there. It's a cruel trick, one designed to lure you deeper into the woods, away from the safety of firelight and companionship. But the Wendigo's mimicry isn't limited to voices. Some stories describe it imitating the sound of snapping twigs, distant footsteps, or even the cries of an injured animal. It uses these sounds to confuse and disorient its prey, drawing them closer until it's too late to escape. Despite these common threads, the Wendigo's appearance often reflects the fears of the culture or individual telling the story. For some, it is a skeletal giant, a physical embodiment of starvation and greed. For others, it is a ghostly presence, a spirit that haunts the edges of the firelight. And in modern tales, it sometimes takes on elements of popular horror imagery, more beast than man, with glowing eyes, antlers, and a terrifying animalistic snarl. One tale from the Cree describes the Wendigo as so emaciated that it's impossible to tell where its skin ends and its bones begin. Its body was like the bare branches of a tree in winter, the elder recounted. Its ribs poked out like broken twigs, and its breath rattled like the wind through a hollow log. Other accounts add to the lore. Among the Innu people, the Wendigo is said to have a heart of ice, cold and unyielding, a symbol of its inhumanity. To kill the Wendigo, some say, you must shatter this frozen heart, though few have ever claimed to have done so. In some Ojibwe stories, the Wendigo is not just a creature, but a spirit, a malevolent force that can possess the weak or desperate. Once possessed, the victim's transformation begins slowly. They grow distant, their eyes haunted, their appetite ravenous. Then comes the craving for human flesh, a hunger so overwhelming that it drives them to madness. By the time the transformation is complete, the person is no longer human. They are Wendigo, lost forever to the curse. But why does the Wendigo take so many forms? Perhaps it is because the creature itself defies understanding. It is not bound by the rules of nature or humanity. It is chaos and hunger personified. Or perhaps the Wendigo's appearance shifts to reflect the fears of those who encounter it, feeding off their terror and growing stronger with every scream. What remains constant is this: the Wendigo is not a creature you ever want to see. Its very existence is an affront to life, a reminder of the darkness that lurks both in the wilderness and within ourselves. Whether it is a spirit, a beast, or something in between, the Wendigo leaves behind more than just victims. It leaves stories, fragments of fear that linger long after the creature has vanished into the shadows. And perhaps that is the Wendigo's greatest power. Not its claws, its teeth, or its insatiable hunger, but its ability to stay with you. Even now, as you read these words, you may find yourself glancing toward the dark corners of the room or straining to hear the faint rustle of leaves outside. The Wendigo has a way of making its presence known, even when it isn't there. Or perhaps it is. Chapter 3. True Encounters, Stories from the Wilderness. Over the years, many have shared their own Wendigo stories, accounts that linger with the people who live through them. These aren't just folklore. They're personal experiences that often defy explanation. Let's dive into some of the most chilling accounts. Story 1. The Stalker in the Dark. I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you who don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I've been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope costing literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it. I took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck and had easy-to-find spots where I could set up and overlook a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventfully, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd scouted days earlier. It probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to explore with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot didn't have much animal activity at all, no rabbits or owls. The deer I'd seen were hundreds of yards away from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night, but lively during the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m., and it was about 2 a.m. when I started thinking about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch coming from the direction I had come from earlier. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting when I realized it wasn't a bear, it was a man, because he was so low and hunched over. I initially thought I was looking at a young bear. Was it a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen headlights coming up the road from where I was perched, and where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public land. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, twitchy, like a squirrel, grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around, and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something that still gives me nightmares. He squatted, placed his hands in the dirt between his feet, and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. Then I heard it, a voice coming from his direction. A very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost!" There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Was he lost? Had this guy gone crazy out here? Why did his voice sound so feminine? "Help! Please! I can't walk!" The voice called out again. That's when I called it. This wasn't right. Not only could he walk, but when I first saw him, he was moving across the land with ease for someone naked. So much ease, in fact, that I mistook him for a bear. This was a trap. This guy was trying to lure me to him with some kind of damsel in distress routine. Fortunately, the lack of activity earlier had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but in that moment, I didn't care. I took my eyes off him for a moment to grab my pack and buckle my chest strap. When I scrambled for my rifle and looked back, to my horror, he was in the same position, but now his face was staring directly at me. I swear he was smiling. The thermal scope gives an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white, and his eyes were shining like that. How had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have been at least 150 yards away. "Leave me alone!" I yelled in his direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was, easily 6 feet tall and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively fired a round above his head into the tree line. He was terrifying, but he hadn't outright threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I wasn't ready or willing to shoot someone. He stopped in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one won't miss. Go away!" I shouted. This time, I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes hovered just above the grass, like a large cat. I was trembling, and my voice cracked a little during that last warning. The standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. Suddenly, he bolted to the left toward the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope. He was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I fired another shot high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket my magazine to swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it. I didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in a weird sound that could have been either a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and reached my truck breathless. I threw my gear into the cab, kept the rifle in the passenger seat, and sped off. For the longest time, I told this story as if I'd encountered a deranged person living off the land, like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone. I never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story on a camping trip that my nephew mentioned Wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story terrified him because the spot where we were camping was technically the same forest, just 50 miles east of where I'd seen the figure. He was so spooked that his mom had to take him home. She was furious. Since then, I've gone down the rabbit hole of these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw was definitely a Wendigo, but if such things exist, I might have dodged a bullet that night. Or maybe it was just a tweaker acting bizarre in the middle of the night. Either way, I thought I'd share. Story 2. Guiding canoe trips in Wendigo country. I have spent the past 2 summers guiding canoe trips in Lake of the Woods in Minnesota, Manitoba, and have had a few run-ins, as well as heard many stories from other guides about their experiences. The Ojibwe have lived in this area for thousands of years, and there are many places where we cannot camp because they are Indian reservations. I have heard this area referred to as Wendigo country, and there are multiple places named after it, like the Wendigo Islands, for example. I have plenty of stories that have been passed on by other guides, many of which are pretty terrifying. I could share more if there is interest, but I will focus on one experience I was personally involved in. It was me, another guide, and about 7 kids on this trip. On the first night, we stopped after a long day of paddling at a campsite, known as Little Trisket. We had one camper with us who was somewhere on the autism spectrum and had significant communication issues. As we were making dinner over the fire, he seemed to notice something in the woods behind us. He kept saying things like, "Who is that man in the woods?" and described it as a tall, skinny man who was all white. We assured him that no one was there, and we did a head count to ensure all the kids were accounted for. We checked the area but didn't see anything, so we brushed it off and returned to making dinner. That same night, a different camper was in her tent by herself, as she was the only girl on the trip. As my co-guide and I were starting to fall asleep, we heard her say, "Gilly Vanilly, stop." We replied, "What?" "We are in our tent." She brushed it off and went to bed. In the morning, we asked her what had happened. She explained that something had been shaking her tent, and she thought it was us. It hadn't been a windy night. The boys were all in their tents, and we had been in ours. When we took her tent down and removed the stakes, we noticed that 2 of them were completely bent at a 90-degree angle. We tested their flexibility and couldn't get them to budge back. I've experienced crazy windstorms out there, with winds around 30, 40 miles per hour, and had never seen stakes bend like that. We left Little Trisket, and the weird occurrences stopped. The rest of the trip was awesome. However, when we got back to base camp, I spoke to another guide who stayed at that same campsite the night after us. Without me saying anything, she mentioned, "There is some sort of big white creature at that campsite." She explained that she had gone into the woods to use the bathroom and thought a camper had accidentally wandered into her spot and run away. But when she returned, everyone was still at the fire, and no one had left in her absence. There are much scarier stories and experiences other guides have shared about spirits in this area. This was my first encounter, and hopefully it will be my last. We try to treat the wilderness, the spirits, and the native culture with the utmost respect. This respect makes me feel safe, at least in my mind, as almost every other story I've heard begins with someone disrespecting the land or claiming not to believe in its spirits. Story 3. Ethan's stories about the Wendigo. This is a story I was told by one of the other guides who had spent around 6 years guiding canoe trips in Lake of the Woods. Let's call him Ethan. I want to remind you that I did not personally experience this story, but Ethan shared several experiences he and other guides had encountered. One thing I want to emphasize is that we do not joke about Wendigos at our place of work. We no longer tell these stories to campers, nor do we say the name Wendigo. Instead, we refer to them only as Ws. I am not an expert in Wendigos or Native American Canadian culture, and I hope not to offend anyone. The knowledge I have on them has been passed down by guides and their experiences. One detail Ethan emphasized before telling his story was that a definitive way to identify a Wendigo is by its 2 bright, glowing red eyes. One summer, about 5-6 years ago, Ethan had a couple of encounters with the Wendigo. His first encounter occurred during an earlier trip in the summer. The destination was Shoal Lake. It was a 6-day trip that included about 60 miles of paddling and 1 portage into Shoal. On day 4, they were portaging back out of Shoal through a portage called Dead Man's Portage. The name sounds like something out of a horror story, but the portage from Lake of the Woods into Shoal really is called Dead Man's Portage. No one knows exactly why, but the name is fitting. There was a campsite frequently used about half a mile from the portage, which they called Dead Man's. Ethan's group aimed to get through Dead Man's Portage and camp at the site just after it. The portage was a little long, but relatively flat and maintained, likely the only one in Lake of the Woods regularly cleared by the Canadian Park Service. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite was surreal and beautiful, passing through a narrow stream with 10, 15-foot cliffs covered in moss and cedars. Ethan's group reached Dead Man's campsite. Just before they went to bed, they realized they had left their sleeping backpack at the end of the portage. By this point, it was around 9 p.m. and growing dark. Ethan and a camper set off in a canoe with headlamps to retrieve the pack. The paddle took about 30 minutes, and by then, the only visible area was illuminated by their headlamps. They grabbed the pack and began heading back. Shortly after leaving, Ethan started hearing loud splashes trailing behind them. At first, he dismissed the sounds as beavers slapping their tails, which can sound like large rocks being thrown into the water. However, the splashes continued, following them closely. Ethan turned around and saw a basketball-sized rock flying through the air before landing in the water beside him. They paddled frantically to escape whatever was throwing these massive rocks. At one point, Ethan looked back and saw, perched on a cliff about 15 feet above them, two distinct red glowing eyes. The rocks stopped as they neared the campsite, and they made it back safely. The rest of their trip was uneventful, but Ethan admitted that he never feels at ease going through Dead Man's Portage anymore. He now triple-checks that no packs are left behind. Story 4. Grandma's Tales. When I was young, I often spent parts of my summers with my grandmother in her home out in the country. It was my favorite place in the world, and I always looked forward to week-long stays filled with gardening, baking, late-night fires with esmores and ghost stories, and enjoying having my grandmother all to myself. There was a pond not far from her house where I would sometimes go swimming. It was home to quite a few frogs, and at night, they made the most incessant noises. I complained to my grandmother only once, saying I couldn't enjoy the night breeze with all that racket. She took me on her lap and told me a story about an old man and woman who lived near a lake. The old man couldn't stand the singing of the frogs, but his wife warned him that they kept the Wendigo away and that harming them would be unwise. He didn't listen and set about methodically catching all the frogs on the lake. It took some time, but he didn't stop until he had rid the lake of the pesky amphibians. That night, without the frog's protection, he and his wife were slaughtered by the Wendigo, a vicious, whip-like demon creature with elongated fingers ending in razor-sharp talons and rows of silver teeth as thin and keen as needles. I wrote it off as another of her ghost stories, though she seemed more serious about this one than usual. I never complained about the frogs again, mostly because I grew to enjoy them, and I put the story out of my mind. In fact, I'd forgotten all about it until it came up this past spring in a Native American literature class I was taking in college. The mention of the Wendigo sparked an old memory of my grandmother's story. I thought she had made up the word. I didn't realize there were stories about it originating in Algonquian legends. Eager to connect something from my childhood to the topic, I Googled it, only to find that my grandmother had apparently been mistaken. There was nothing I could find about her story or any references to frogs providing protection from the Wendigo. In fact, the Wendigo of legend seemed very little like my grandmother's version. It was said to be insatiable, craving human flesh, and sometimes created from the forms of people who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Descriptions varied, but they sounded almost nothing like my grandmother's bogeyman version. I actually chuckled as I read, feeling a bit embarrassed by how badly my grandmother had apparently messed up the original tale. I moved this summer to a newly built duplex on the edge of town. Even though my new place is only a few minutes from the town center, it feels much more isolated. I enjoy the seclusion and its proximity to nature. I'm surrounded by woods, and from my patio, I can see a pond beyond the carefully landscaped lawn. Just like the pond near my grandmother's house, the frogs have put up a ferocious racket lately. I've grown used to the noise, finding it comforting during the stress of moving. Tonight, however, is different. I find myself standing in my living room, staring in the direction of the pond, though I can't see it in the dark. The air is eerily still and oppressively warm, yet all my windows are shut, and I feel impossibly cold. I'd long since convinced myself that my grandmother's story was nothing more than a silly tale. But for some reason, I have the most overwhelming sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what to do. I feel trapped. Leaving my house means braving the darkness beyond, but I'm not sure I'm safe here either. The frogs have stopped singing. Story 5. Shadows in the Wilderness. Late fall, 2010. In northern Canada, I went deep into the wilderness with my father and eldest brother to hunt for moose. We left early in the morning, just before sunrise, trying to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. We traveled winding rivers and repeatedly portaged over rapids all day. We set up camp just over halfway to our destination, figuring we'd make the rest of the journey the next day. That night, I decided to gather some firewood and relieve myself down by the riverbank, just out of reach of the light from the campfire. Out from the tree line, about 15 yards away, I heard rustling in the bushes. I focused on the area, feeling dizzy and lightheaded. A putrid stink, like old milk or rotten food, filled the air. The trees seemed to morph and move slightly, taking the shape of a head and faint facial features. The voice of a recently deceased relative came from the shadows. "Hello," they said. "I've missed you. Come see me." I smiled and stepped forward but stopped, analyzing the situation. Their face turned pale, and flesh began to peel away, revealing bone. I backed away, heading toward the firelight, but the voice became angry, shouting at me to come here. I turned to run but glanced back one last time. What I saw was horrifying. Rotting flesh on gnawed bone, caved-in eyes, and a hollow chest cavity. The humanoid creature was tall and super thin. Terror gripped me as I ran back to camp. My brother pulled me up from the riverbank, and we spent the rest of the night awake, rifles loaded. At sunrise, we packed up and left, never speaking of it to anyone out of fear of being called liars. Chapter 4. What to do if you encounter the Wendigo. So, you're out in the woods, and something doesn't feel right. Maybe it's the way the wind suddenly stopped, or the eerie sound of someone calling your name from the darkness. Whatever it is, you've got a gut feeling that the Wendigo might be near. First things first, don't engage. Don't call out, and definitely don't go investigating strange noises. Trust me, curiosity won't just kill the cat, it'll get you too. Just leave. Quietly. Quickly. Fire, they say, is your best friend in a situation like this. Many stories from indigenous traditions describe how the Wendigo is repelled by fire. It's a symbol of life, warmth, and everything the Wendigo stands against. If you've got a fire going, stay close to it. If you don't, make one, and make it fast. The most important thing is to stay calm. It is easier said than done when there's something lurking in the shadows, but fear is said to feed the Wendigo. Panic makes you vulnerable, and that's the last thing you want. Here's the thing. The Wendigo is as much a psychological threat as it is a physical one. It's said to mess with your mind, make you doubt what's real. Worse still, it's known to mimic voices, often those of people you know or love, calling you deeper into the woods. You might hear a friend's voice crying for help, or a familiar laugh just beyond the trees. Don't trust it. Whatever you hear, resist the urge to respond or follow. That's exactly how it lures its victims. That's why preparation matters so much. If you're heading into the wilderness, know your terrain, plan your routes, stick to familiar paths, and make sure you've got a way to start a fire no matter what. And hey, don't wander off alone if you can help it. Lone travelers are easy targets. Chapter 5. Is it fact or fiction? And now we come to the question that has lingered since the first whispered tales of the Wendigo. Is it real? Skeptics argue that the Wendigo is nothing more than folklore, a story to explain the inexplicable and to keep communities united in times of scarcity. They point to starvation psychosis, a condition where extreme hunger can induce hallucinations, as the basis for many sightings. But others believe. They point to the chilling consistency in descriptions across centuries and cultures, suggesting the Wendigo is more than a figment of imagination. Cryptozoologists posit that it might be an undiscovered species, lurking in the remotest regions. Meanwhile, spiritualists see it as a manifestation of collective fear, a thought form brought to life by the energy of those who believe. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The Wendigo could be both fact and fiction, a creature of the mind and the wild, born from the dark corners of human experience. But one thing is certain. The Wendigo legend is not just a story you hear. It's a story that stays with you. And now that you've heard it, perhaps you'll start noticing shadows where there were none, or footsteps in the snow that don't match your own. So, is the Wendigo real? That's for you to decide. But if you find yourself alone in the woods, and you hear a voice calling your name, don't answer.